Everybody, thanks for coming back on time. Thankfully, we have a very, first of all, I'm Chris Carlston, professor at UBC and part of the organizing committee. I'm really happy to be here and again, find an incredibly high quality set of presentations and audience participation as always here at this symposium. So this afternoon, we are going to have 4 speakers of equal quality and passion as this morning. I think you're going to learn a lot as you did already. I'm going to start with Dr. Michael Schwandt. You'll see his bio in your program. One thing I learned just now, I guess I hadn't known this previously, but he's a latent rock drummer. We can have a discussion about exactly what that means. But in this context, I really enjoy having interacted with Michael because he's at the interface between the science that many of you have heard about and the real work of public health. He's a physician and applies that to public health settings, which is something that I'm a big fan of. Today he's going to talk about clean air shelters. We'll find out about the novelty of them as implied by his title. I'm going to hand it over to Michael and thank you again, Dr. Michael Schwandt.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to the audience and to the speakers today. It's sometimes joked that the post-lunch slot is not to be envied. I feel the opposite way. I think that coming back fueled up with the musical trivia game and also having had morning speakers that covered the nature, the constituents of wildfire smoke, health impacts and interventions really puts me in a great position to be able to look at one specific intervention, speaking about community air shelters, and really appreciate the excellent morning that we've had so far. Wanted to acknowledge the land that we're gathered on here today. Vancouver Coastal Health, where I work, we operate from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in our Vancouver offices, and also a total of 14 First Nations across our region. It's important to note that processes of colonialism have, to a large extent, driven climate change and driven some of the disproportionate impacts that we're talking about throughout the session. Very important to carry a commitment to reconciliation in our work on this topic. So thanks for that. Team effort, the work that most of us do in this field, whether it's with partners from different organizations or within our organization. I just wanted to highlight, sometimes this is you've seen at the end of presentations, I wanted to at the beginning. Many of these folks are here in the room, so if you see them at your table, definitely give them a nod and some applause as well. This is our Healthy Environments and Climate Change team at Vancouver Coastal Health. About 5 years ago, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were maybe 2 to 3 full-time equivalents dedicated to this work, a lot of sides of desks involved. During the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of people dedicated to this work was an imaginary number because all of these folks, for the most part, were redeployed to the COVID-19 response. But as we've transitioned to another stage of the pandemic, we've seen many folks transferring back to some of their core work, the work that they're passionate about in healthy environments and climate change. And you'll see there that we have an excellent interdisciplinary team with training and experience and practice in several different areas. And it's just really wanted to highlight again, our teammates that are here in the room who have contributed to this presentation as well. Today, I'll speak to you about the local health impacts of wildfire smoke briefly. I knew that within this presentation, we had a really excellent tour, an excellent update on the multi-system impacts of wildfire smoke on our health. Wanted to touch a little bit on some of the local findings that we have, talking about cleaner air spaces and their potential roles, and then looking at a couple of specific projects within Vancouver Coastal Health. So first of all, you'll know very well, and we've discussed this morning, exposure to wildfire smoke can impact health. Some of you will have seen similar figures to this. This is drawn from BC CDC's monitoring data, you'll see in the green line, the fine particulate matter concentration day to day throughout the summer of the year 2000 in this case. So you'll see some variation week to week, and a large spike, of course, during the late summer wildfires that we experienced that year. Now you'll also see in the top figure asthma-related physician visits, and in the bottom figure dispensations of asthma inhalers, specifically salbutamol and known as Ventolin, during that event. So you'll see that we have a dramatic spike in those health impacts. So these are kind of the wide part of the iceberg. We know that a lot of people who are experiencing wildfire-related illness, respiratory impacts, and others might go to a physician. They might need to refill their prescriptions, and we know as well as that there's more severe morbidity and mortality as well. And this is just one of the data sources that we have. Now, another one within Vancouver Coastal Health, another just local piece of data that I wanted to highlight was just a emergency room physician and colleagues working through UBC's emergency medicine program and Vancouver General, as well as other centers, looked at the increases in emergency room visits related to respiratory causes during wildfire season. And they found here, just to parse this graph, for every 10 micrograms per cubic meter increase in particulate matter exposure, they found an increase of 5% in terms of the number of the relative risk, that is, of emergency room visits due to respiratory causes. So this is just highlighting that, again, this is, we have seen in other cases cardiovascular illness, even mental health seen as being associated with wildfire smoke, but this really highlighted that acute risk they noted day to day of wildfire smoke exposure. And again, this is pulling from 6 emergency rooms within Vancouver Coastal Health. So what are these cleaner air spaces? We heard a little bit about it in the National Collaborating Center on Methods and Tools review of different interventions earlier today. Quite simply put, these are spaces, they're community-based, where the air is going to be cleaner, we hope, than outdoor air. They can offer short-term relief during times of deterioration in air quality. Important to note that they can't necessarily, and rarely are they going to be a round-the-clock solution. This is not something that people are going to be able to access for 24 hours a day in most cases, but can provide valuable refuge depending on somebody's living situation and their need to be exposed to wildfire smoke otherwise. So as we've noted here, this is available for people who aren't able to maintain good air quality in their home, or perhaps aren't able to shelter in place in their home due to reasons of overcrowding, potentially due to underhousing or even homelessness in some cases. So there's I think, very important populations, and we need to think of the diversity of our communities when we think of the potential impacts and the effects of these interventions. Would describe these as one tool in a set of tools to help to reduce population exposure to wildfire smoke. Most folks in this room will know very well that's not going to be the only tool. We need to look at the home environment. We need to look at communications. Reducing the incidence and the severity of wildfires in general are all other pieces of this puzzle. So this is one of a set of interventions. Now, in terms of the goals for cleaner air spaces, Health Canada has described, and this is from a 2020 document, target conditions for cleaner air spaces. And I've italicized target for a reason here. We know that the diversity of spaces, as I'll describe to you, is really quite wide. There's a number of different community spaces that might be utilized for protection from wildfire smoke. So it's very important to know that, again, we want to be better than the outdoor smoky environment, potentially better than another environment to which someone could be exposed. We don't necessarily need to have the perfect be the enemy of the good, but we do always strive for the best that we can be. So certainly fine particulate matter levels being as low as possible, certainly lower than outdoors are reasonable goals. Some of these other air quality considerations that are important, temperature as well. We know that many of the wildfire events that we're looking at can occur concurrently with extreme heat events. So there's a lot of other considerations too, but the goals have been described by Health Canada. Now, we have a number of community partners, municipal governments, non-governmental organizations. I'll highlight Metro Vancouver through their well-named Air C&C program. This is the Cool and Clean Air project, trying to identify community spaces that can be used for refuge during wildfire smoke events, often asking what kind of spaces can be used. There's such a variety of them out there. What sort of spaces might be amenable to this sort of function? Is it specifically municipal spaces? Could this be non-governmental spaces? Commercial spaces? These have all been considered, and we've, as a public health program, often consulted about this, have started to work on trying to answer this question of what might be the most effective spaces and their characteristics. We know that some of the most common spaces, and I would highlight, you may have seen some of these in your travels, a community center, a recreation center gym. closed for its usual sort of open gym or instructional purposes and set up as a clean air shelter. Very common model, whether in Vancouver Coastal Health or more broadly. This is a few notes about this type of center. Usually these are going to require often added staffing above and beyond, either people who have been reassigned from other duties, often recreational staff otherwise, assigned to this work, often with air filters added to try to create additional protection above and beyond what the physical structure might offer at baseline. And in most cases that we've looked at, fairly limited data has been available on the uptake, the usage of these centers. The reason for that is that we found that having a low barrier to access is very important. We don't necessarily want to introduce a barrier where people need to produce ID, give a phone number and a name, and other personal details to sign in. So for the most part, our partners operating these sites have found that it's difficult to describe exactly how many people have come in, how many do people come in repeatedly, how long do they stay, just because the monitoring in that way has been found in some cases to be counter to the goals of a low barrier site. So generally speaking, we do have some feedback that the uptake varies quite a bit, not just based on the severity of the wildfire event at the time, but due to some other barriers as well that I'll describe in some more detail on subsequent slides. So this has led to us identifying these opportunities for use of other community spaces, spaces that might be familiar from people's day-to-day lives. We found that places like adult day centers, libraries, community centers where people might be attending classes or making social connection already can have a very valuable role. So we're not asking people to go to a, quote, shelter that they wouldn't attend normally, but letting people know that, that space that you go to for that lesson on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you can also go there to take shelter during this wildfire event. At this place that you take your children for childminding, you can actually just stay there so you don't have to go back out into the smoke to take that time. So we're really trying to look at existing spaces whose functions are already used and trusted, have trusted personnel involved, and potentially using those. Now, it's important to note that unlike those more conventional spaces that I described above that are selected usually for their technical configurations and the thought that they'll actually be protective from wildfire smoke, this is a little bit reversed with some of these community spaces when they're selected for the existing functions, for the nature of the space, the way that people are already interfacing with the space, and not necessarily so much for their actual protection from wildfire smoke per se on a technical level. So it does add sometimes a little bit of added work in terms of what we need to do to make these into protective spaces. As we heard from Professor Nazaroff this morning, a building in and of itself, 4 walls and a roof, is not a guarantee of reduced exposure to particulate matter or other contaminants in the indoor space. So as we've studied and tried to understand what are some features that might facilitate uptake of these sorts of spaces, we've taken some lessons from research on cooling centers, so spaces that are used during extreme heat events, and tried to apply some of that information to, I think, really underscore the rationale for applying a broader imagination to what sort of spaces we can use for air quality shelters. So a couple of things that were noted, and this is from a report that's called Lived Experience of Extreme Heat in BC, specifically looking at the experience of people at a high risk during the 2021 BC heat dome. And some people had noted that transportation were barriers. I won't read these quotations out to you. I can see that folks are directing your eyes to them and probably scanning them as I speak. But really, the transportation, getting to the space itself is very important. The fact that disability, remote locations, access to public or transit or private options have been raised as challenges. So the density of these sites on the ground has been very important. So we looked at cities, one example is in Toronto, that doesn't have just a few heat shelters, but in fact what they've described as a heat relief network. So bringing on board many different sites, places again that people might be attending already, so that they know when they're going there, even outside of a wildfire smoke event or a heat event, this is a place I can come during those times, and that's in their mind and available to them, avoiding this issue of distant transportation in the event when making those decisions can be challenging. Now, we've also heard about stigma, discrimination, and diverse needs not being met at some of these centers. Some of the feedback that was found in this lived experience report was that people who are homeless or underhoused weren't always feeling welcome, weren't always feeling that their needs were met in these shelters, The ability to store personal items is usually quite limited in these spaces. If you walk up to again, potentially a community center gym that has some chairs and tables, not really a place to store personal items. And this isn't something that was necessarily planned for in the initial deployment of some of these sites. But we found that a lot of these factors actually are very important for people. The ability to bring a pet, for example, and have a place for it to stay. Maybe not possible for every single site, but that's going to be something that makes these sites more accessible to a lot of people. That, and as well the staff training and sensitivity around a diversity of issues that people might be facing, the presence of discrimination and stigma against people with mental illness that is present throughout much of our society. Really important to understand that and plan to make sure that everyone feels welcome and able to access these sites. Just a couple more examples here that underscoring what I was describing there, this importance of inclusivity and accessibility here. I really like the quote here. This is, I thought, really important. It resonated with our team, this idea that many who could have used the support did not as a result. So this is somebody, service provider, describing the people they work with day to day, knowing that they may have benefited from the site, but feeling like there were barriers that they encountered, specifically related to cooling centers. So, reflecting back on that, factors that could support use of community airspaces for cleaner air, and we've seen some of these in action, the accessibility, making sure that we don't have a discriminatory context, that there are low barrier approaches in ways that I've described. Accessibility by public transportation, absolutely crucial. We find that some of the highest risk people at need might also experience transportation barriers. Considerations for disability are very important too. We think that whether it's mobility, sensory, or other, that we need to think through the same approach that we apply to accessibility in all of our healthcare facilities and others needs to be applied to these sites. And then programming in the sites. We're not talking about a half hour or 60 minutes of refuge to really get the most possible benefit. The time accrued in these spaces becomes quite important. So again, just setting up a set of chairs and desks, we need to go a step further. And we've seen a lot of our municipal governments, City of Vancouver included, starting to think about the actual programming of the sites. So having entertainment, something as simple as a movie playing, having card games and board games, things for kids. If we're hoping that people might come to spend 3 hours, 4 hours plus in these sites, maybe day after day during a longer-term wildfire event, we really need to think about what are people actually going to do in that space. Wi-Fi is another thing that's been highlighted as a major consideration to people's ability to stay put and to be able to potentially even deal with other life responsibilities. In terms of public messaging, the sites for these spaces, very important to communicate them. We get a lot of feedback at Vancouver Coastal Health, where we are quite proud of our social media presence on a number of platforms. That absolutely cannot be the only way that we get messages out. You saw on some of the slides previously that use of radio, of community newspapers, other ways to get messages out before events on what those spaces, these spaces of refuge might be, and during events, where they are. Really crucial to think of the audiences that are actually potentially using these spaces and making sure that we're using appropriate modes of communication, not just the most expedient to get the messages out, but thinking about how we can get to populations who most need to see them. Now, as well as all of these factors that might promote accessibility and acceptability of the sites, there are a number of considerations on this. Knowing of the talks that we'd have this morning on protection of indoor spaces, this is just a brief review, but it's very important, where possible, that these spaces should have, of course, a well-maintained HVAC system. The highest possible level of filtration is recommended. We wouldn't say to a site, you must absolutely have MERV 16 filtration. We would always say that we would definitely like to see some. The option for portable filtration is there too, but we generally would take an approach of as high as reasonably achievable in these cases, rather than setting a firm bar that must be applied. Ventilation that can switch to outdoor and indoor intake can be very helpful in these cases for clear reasons. And the potential to monitor air quality, both indoors and outdoors, understanding what is the actual indoor air quality, the presence of particulate matter, or potentially the presence of carbon dioxide in a crowded setting, would be very helpful as well. Again, not an absolute prerequisite to forming a community air quality, community air shelter, but these are some positive things that we would recommend and support. So related to that, I'll wrap up the final phase of this presentation about some of our VCH air quality monitoring projects that we've engaged in. The pair that the major branches of that are our particulate matter monitors, so low-cost portable air quality air monitors for particulate matter, and also carbon dioxide. For reasons of presentation length, I've put aside the carbon dioxide monitor loaning program, and I'll focus on the particulate matter piece for the rest of this presentation. So the first goal that we identified for that is to address gaps in air quality monitoring. Many of our rural and remote community sites in particular have identified that the nearest air quality monitor, when they go to governmental sites, is often quite a distance from where they are. And even if there might be a reasonable correlation between what they're reading about their site and the current air quality, it's not always the case. And we've been told that there's nothing that takes people off of trying to find and apply air quality information than seeing that the air quality health index in their closest to their community is 2 when they're sitting in pea soup smog outside. And with the geography and microclimates of BC, it's not unusual that people in rural and remote communities are seeing very different reports in some of the regulatory reporting than what they might be aware of, than might actually be happening, that they're aware of in their own day-to-day or minute-to-minute experience. I'd say you should note within Metro Vancouver, the density of monitors on the ground is quite a bit different. It's quite a bit higher, so that people are usually going to see readings that reflect their current experience, but there still is, there's been shown in evidence, quite a bit of value to personalization. So people knowing the current particulate matter concentration or air quality health index closer to their location, much more impactful generally than something more distant. We've tried to apply indoor and outdoor pairing. This has been helpful in our communications with some of these spaces to let them know. Are the interventions that they're taking working? Is the particulate matter quite a bit better inside or outside? Is it close to the same? If they're able to make interventions during the event, does that produce a change? We've really found that this paired approach has been quite helpful. And then finally, we want to increase public awareness of the issue. And again, we find that awareness of the sites, publication of this information, posting of the information in the sites has been really helpful at the individual level and the organizational level for some of these partners. So who are these partners? There's a number of different spaces that we've worked with. At this point, over 60 of these low-cost air quality monitors have been installed in 2 different projects that I'll describe. These are in neighborhood houses and family places. These are sort of non-governmental entities that exist within BC. Most of you will be aware of. Community centers, adult day centers, as I mentioned before. I won't name these all out loud, but I think that that seniors housing has been an important one for us as well. A lot of this work was supported by an MPH student that we've worked with, who I would describe as not only proactive, but almost swashbuckling in his approach to installing these sensors, out driving around to these sites, befriending maintenance personnel, literally climbing on rooftops to install them, all almost entirely within the within workplace health regulations, as far as I'm told. And some of the rural sites that we've been able to work with include these listed here: Pemberton and Little Watt Nation, Powell River, Cathet. All of these communities, as I had mentioned, have highlighted the distance to the nearest regulatory monitor, as you'll see in a blue diamond in the figure in the map on the right, or not at all in the map on the left. So these are communities that are saying, we're just not really feeling like we have direct information on what's happening where we live. And so we've been able to add some of these monitors, 40 in the rural and remote stream of our program, a little bit more than 40, in 5 different communities, including 3 First Nations. And thus far, we found that the feedback on the availability of that information has been very positive. We're trying to continue to work with those communities on that knowledge mobilization. How do we actually get that information into the hands of community members, of people who are operating, whether that's the local government leaders or some of the non-governmental organizations that are supporting people? How can we action that more to help with the uptake of some of those behaviors, those healthy behaviors that were described this morning? Another piece of our work has been the deployment, this is within Metro Vancouver, to some of these both conventional sites, which I would call them, so some of these longer standing cleaner air sites, which are highlighted here in blue, and non-conventional sites. So sites that had not been cleaner air spaces before the beginning of this project, but who had identified the possibility that they could offer refuge from wildfire smoke to the regular participants in their programs in the lighter blue color. So as you'll see, we had a pretty good distribution across the lower mainland area. People in the health field will know that our jurisdiction in Vancouver cuts off at Boundary Road. This is why there's none in Burnaby, but it's definitely pretty good coverage within the west of that, where we operate in Vancouver Coastal Health. So one thing that I'd highlight here is that we found a wide variation in terms of how impactful these sites were in terms of reducing indoor exposure to particulate matter. You'll see in the left map here, you see the readings, 24-hour averages on an air quality advisory day from again, outside, the monitors placed outside of these sites. So you'll see here, all of them were experiencing high levels of particulate matter on that day. In the graph on the map on the right, we see that there's quite a variety. Some of them were experiencing high levels of particulate matter inside on this day of an air quality advisory, which is of course not the goal. But we did find that many of them had quite significantly reduced areas inside. I'd say that most of them were able to reduce that exposure, although unfortunately not all. There was quite a variety in that reduction. How big of a variety? Here in this graph, looking at these comparisons, you'll see the blue line here is showing the outdoor particulate matter at both of these sites, and the green line is showing the indoor particulate matter reading at these two sites. You'll see on the left, this is one of our sites that had almost zero infiltration of particulate matter. This is the only measure that this particular sensor covers, but we felt very positive for this site. Not shockingly, this was a relatively new building, purpose-built to be a venue for an Olympic event in 2010. So this is a building that has excellent air quality and HVAC facilities. Not that Olympic participation is necessarily a marker of excellence in air quality protection, but it wasn't shocking to us that the Richmond Olympic Oval had very good indoor air quality, and positively so. This is a space where we were told families can go and spend not just hours, but the whole day, especially on days where activities like going to the park, spending time outside might not be recommended due to wildfire smoke. People are able to spend time there, have lunch, participate in many different activities across the family. So this is something that was quite positive. Now this other site, you'll see there's pretty marginal protection from particulate matter infiltration, as you'll see. You see that the green line is thankfully lower, but not a whole lot compared to the blue line of the outdoor particulate matter. And it might surprise you to learn that this was, or it might not, depending on how closely you were paying attention to the morning's presentations. This was a LEED certified building. It did have a dedicated outdoor air supply, but whether or not how that was being applied during the wildfire smoke event is potentially an area for concern or for improvement. But we saw this was not just an old building where the windows were open and there's no moving air, ventilation, or filtration. It's a relatively modern building within the Lower Mainland, and it's a municipal site that was kind of under consideration for future use as an air quality shelter. And in fact, people actively deciding to use this as ad hoc as an air quality shelter, just knowing that it was an indoor space, and current public health advice was to avoid outdoor spaces. So we want to continue to study more. And we're going to go further into the data beyond this kind of qualitative look, the test of the ocular test, if you will, of the data, but actually looking at what were the building factors that were predictive of protection in the indoor space, not just in terms of the technical specifications of the building, but the operational characteristics, the activities that were being conducted. Are these sites where people come and go? Are these sites where there's a discrete start and stop to activities, or is there kind of constant traffic through? There's a lot of different considerations that are important, and we tried to gather as much data as we could on these different buildings so that we can study them more deeply going forward. One thing I would note is that we had very strong interest from the community groups that got involved with this project. Of course, they were self-selected. Nobody was required to do so, but we tried to produce reasonably user-friendly reports and actually work with them throughout the season to target new air quality interventions. So in one case, we had members of some of these sites actually attend a local workshop on developing do-it-yourself box fan air filters. A number of sites actually deployed those during the site. So we tried to, as the summer rolled on, to actually measure and try to give some feedback on whether or not these were having an impact, whether they were protective. And in a couple of sites, they in fact did seem to have better results. Again, we need to test these quantitatively over time, but did seem to be impactful and did a lot to raise awareness of the operators of the space. So in terms of next steps, we want to continue to partner with these organizations, communicate with them the findings that we have from the initial set, and hopefully expand some of this work to develop more community spaces as cleaner air spaces. I think that there's a lot of potential here, but also I think we need to be really clear on this idea that not every indoor space is necessarily going to be completely protective. We need to continue to share the information that we have on how they can actually be effective. Financially as well as trying to support some of these organizations from a technical perspective. We've given fiscal support to a number of organizations, or operational support to deploying these governmental funds. BC Hydro has had a partnership in which they've deployed portable air conditioning or funding to support heat pump acquisition that 10 different organizations have taken up, and 28 organizations have actually taken up a BC Hydro offer of portable HEPA filters. We've worked together with Hydro to help identify those organizations. These are organizations where people are spending time for health, social, and human services already, and could potentially use as protective spaces during wildfires. As well as that, generally expanding our VCH health promotion grants to apply to climate change planning for community-based organizations. We know that the community-based space, the non-governmental space, not-for-profits, are carrying a lot of effort in this all-of-society response to climate change. We want to make sure that they're well supported. And the final set of next steps that I'll describe, continuing to raise awareness of these local air quality monitors, making sure that people are aware of, we really try to say as our first communication to go to your regulatory monitors, look to the sites, whether that's Metro Vancouver or other sorts of information. But for people in rural and remote communities, being aware of these other sites, so being aware of purple air monitors, without endorsing any specific monitor or company, being aware that there is other information, and there are platforms that we could discuss further, like UNBC's, to help to bring some of this information together for easy viewing. And then informing policy as well. We think it's very important to note that the buildings need to be, in a changing climate, need to be designed and constructed and maintained in a way that is protective from wildfire smoke. That includes not only these buildings that I'm describing as potential community clean air shelters, but the home, of course, where people are spending most of their indoor time. And the ideal state, of course, is one where people don't necessarily need to take refuge from the home and from the outside, but are protected in their home as well. Just wanted to applaud. Public health is often advocating for and describing what we would love to see from a policy perspective, so I certainly want to note when we see positive developments. So this was not too long ago, it doesn't seem like anyway, summer before last, May 2022, we saw an update to Vancouver's building bylaw describing, I thought very positively, steps towards both climate change mitigation, looking at reductions in the carbon emissions of medium-sized apartment buildings and condominiums, but also requirements for air filtration and an outcome-based, a performance-based cooling requirement for buildings as well. So we see here, I think, a positive policy example in terms of both, again, climate change adaptation and mitigation, which does remain crucial. You can read a little bit more about Vancouver Coastal Health's work. We recently produced a report called Protecting Population Health in a Climate Emergency. That's available on our website naturally. It describes health impacts and interventions around wildfire smoke, but also heat, flooding, drought, and a variety of other hazards. And we have a number of resources for community-based organizations, for members of the public, that are intended to complement the resources available from BC CDC and other partners. So thanks very much for your time, and if there's time, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Okay, starting to slip a little bit on time, but yes, please go ahead.
Thanks, great talk. I'm wondering if you can spend a moment to talk about trigger points for what VCH uses to issue a statement or stand up a cleaner airspace, and then also what the trigger point would be to stand down and to end that intervention.
Yeah, that's a really great question. We were just having a bit of a lunchtime conversation with Metro Vancouver colleagues on exactly this point. Within our context, Metro Vancouver is the air quality regulator that declares air quality alerts, working closely with the health authority on setting the thresholds. So unlike where we've gotten to with heat, where we have I'd say, very concrete thresholds in terms of temperature and forecast. With air quality, there are some thresholds, some lines in the sand, but also a fair bit of application of judgment and discussion around the current direction of change and forecasting at play. So I wouldn't say that there's an absolutely firm line in terms of when air quality alerts are declared, but they can be for around particulate matter, ground level ozone, sometimes in isolation, more often at the same time as particulate matter. Usually we've seen that due to wildfire smoke, and then sometimes just to event-based declarations. So things like the Port Fire or the Burns Bog Fire some years ago would lead to that. So I think conceptually we really want to make sure that these declarations we want to avoid the false positives, the declaration of events at thresholds where we don't really expect to see an inflection in health impacts, kind of reserving them for the most important times, which I think challenges many of us in public health, taking the approach that the lowest exposure possible is what we would recommend, but thinking of what is the intended effect of a declaration, usually trying to change behavior in the shorter term and knowing that that's not necessarily going to change longer term behavior. So trying to deploy as an intervention, a short-term intervention, an air quality alert or declaration and the associated communications. We really want to do that when we have the belief that there's some amount of exposure that we can sustainably reduce over the course of a few days. We have sort of another pillar of communications that might relate to just longer term advice. So hope that that's helpful overall.
Michael, let me squeeze something in before Eric that maybe will help, because I get confused about this. In terms of VCH and its obligations, I know it's a kind of a complicated question, but where does everything you discussed fit into in terms of formal obligations of the health authority versus this is the right thing to do and we have a general obligation, a more vague, if you will, obligation towards public health? Are these respecting specific mandates, providing clean air shelters, et cetera, or more this is the right thing to do?
I'd say yes, or in a longer form, both of the above. I could say that it's part of our mandate, definitely, to protect health. I think that you might say, well, Michael, the health authority wasn't doing all of these things to nearly the same extent in 2010, and certainly before that. And I think that our understanding of these risks and our prioritization of bringing some of these into our work probably continues to develop. But I would say that in looking at the Public Health Act, the related regulations, it's firmly within the functions of our regional health authorities to be looking at air quality and to be working with municipal governments and other partners on the topic. So thanks.
Okay, let's thank Michael again. Thank you.